Walter! I said I think the worst part about the downfall of America was the fact that it was boring. Boring in the way that reruns get boring. Like when they keep making the same movies, instead of doing anything different. Something unpredictable would have been not boring. Don't mistake what I said, Walter. I know people were hurt, killed, marginalized, lives were ruined for the holding of wealth because of the ignorance and cruelty of those in charge. It was boring. It was boring in the way something becomes boring once the pattern is fully revealed. Once you are no longer surprised how it plays out. When you can watch people being harmed in real time and know exactly how the justifications will be reruns because they didn't even bother updating the script. We knew how the media would sanitize it because the leaders would always soften it, the law would pretend to be neutral, and the audience, having been so well trained, they will look away towards the next manufactured reason to be afraid. Yeah, the same arguments were recycled, the same bodies would pay the price, how nothing about it would shock anyone who had been paying attention, how the cruelty arrived on schedule, processed through bureaucracy, delivered through policy, normalized by repetition, and absorbed in the routine noise of everyday life until the harm itself stopped registering as an event and instead became the piece of the environment that we were not allowed to fix. Right! Because the part nobody wanted to admit out loud was the fact that we knew what it would look like. And not in a vague historical sense, and not as a metaphor, but actually, almost step by step, because the mechanisms were visible long before the damage peaked. The language was already circulating, being normalized. The enforcement logic was already in place in the schools, in the prisons, and our cultures, because the categories of people who would be marked as disposable were already named. They didn't even really change the targets. The exceptions to humans who would not be allowed rights were already carved out. The justifications were already workshopped and tested. The public was already trained to accept escalation as a safety measure. The cruelty didn't need secrecy to function. It only needed repetition, exhaustion, and just enough time for outrage to decay into routine. Until the question stopped being whether it was happening and became whether anybody would still actually care. I disagree. I observed the downfall in real time, Walter. When it got to that point, it didn't feel like different. It felt like something you already knew, pressing in from every direction at once. Not as news, not as grief, but as a dense, heavy weight that just kept getting heavier and harder to carry, and it lived in the silence. Yeah, that I do agree with, Walter. We already knew who was going to be targeted. It was always going to be those who differed from the regime's practiced version of their wanted expression of gender and class roles. We already knew the kind of language they'd use because we've heard it throughout the fucking centuries. We knew people would pretend not to hear it. What? I already said we knew the script because they didn't bother writing a new one. Yes, they dragged the old one out and updated. The only thing they updated was the tech that they used, like another bad remake that rings cheap and hollow. No, they didn't need new reasons. They just needed enough people to keep showing up to work, enough people to stay confused long enough to keep saying surely not while it's actually happening. Not in secret and definitely not in the shadows anymore, but right out in the open, with badges in places to be seen, with budgets taken from taxes that provided basic needs to being used to pay for pedophile protecting thugs. I do think that's the worst part that doesn't stop hurting, is that everybody knew it. Everybody fucking knew it. There wasn't one line that was crossed because we never drew a line and held it. So everything just kept pressing in the same direction it had always been going until one day you noticed how far you'd already shifted trying just to stand still. Nope, they didn't have to hide it. They didn't even have to sell it. They just had to keep moving fast enough that people forgot what stillness used to feel like. Because once the pacing was broken, once the rhythm of normal got interrupted long enough, people stopped measuring what changed. They just got used to recalculating and recalibrating, because every day there was a new justification. Every week there was a new threshold. Every time someone tried to say, this isn't right, there was already a line of people waiting to explain why it wasn't that bad, or why it wasn't new, or that it wasn't even happening at all. And they said it with confidence. They said it with graphs and charts and pretty pictures. They repeated it over and over with their pretend experts and false equivalents. Walter, they said it like it was helpful, but mostly they said it to themselves. So they didn't have to feel the full weight of what they were doing, because if they had felt it, and I mean really felt it, if they had honestly felt it themselves, they would have stopped. And nobody seemed willing to stop. They just kept going. Yeah, that made it unbearable. The fact that it kept happening in the open, with everyone trained to pretend that the openness was proof of legitimacy. As if visibility itself somehow cleansed of what was being done. As if standing behind a podium made it permissible, or a uniformed officer speaking calmly into microphones transformed harm into something deserved. Something that was regrettable, but necessary. Until the violence lost its edge, and not because it stopped, but because people learned to look straight at it without letting it register. Because acknowledging it would require fully admitting that the system they were still participating in had chosen profit over the lives of children in the margins. And this had been done so deliberately, it had been done so methodically, and it had been done without apology, relying on the fact that most people would choose the comfort of procedural language over the cost of saying out loud what was happening was just wrong. Fair enough. I did fail to realize how fast people would allow the meanings of our words to be changed. Our leaders let their handlers adjust the language to accommodate it. The words were reshaped so that nothing sounded like what it was anymore. How the rule of law became more important than the health and well-being of children. How immigration enforcement became blanket approval for bigots to hurt people. How fear and silence became consent to justify what the authorities were doing. How disappearance became paperwork. How people doing the damage never had to face any consequences for what they did. We let the media smooth over the harsh edges, standardizing the phrasing and to hide their intent. They repeated the same slogans until the harm slid right past the ear as something ordinary, something administrative even. Exactly. It was something you were expected as the cost of modern convenience. As the definition of function was narrowed to mean an uninterrupted exercise of power, while everything else was treated as noise or a series of unfortunate events that were ultimately unavoidable and unforeseen. as if this was all inevitable and not something we engineered ourselves. We did get to watch people follow orders that they said that they would never follow. We watched in real time as neighbors turned on neighbors in the name of the law because they were scared. Watching uniforms knock on doors that were never supposed to be a part of this. So many people just sat there paralyzed. What? Yes! Just like a startled goat freezing when too much happens at once without time to process it. We were watching people being disappeared. We saw videos of unarmed people that were shot and killed just because the bullies felt threatened by their words. I don't even know how many videos we watched as they dragged innocents through the streets, out of cars, and into systems so thoroughly built for disappearance that there wasn't even a record left to argue with. Just silence. Just absence. Just a line that used to be a person that's now a blank entry in a file that no one can access without clearance that they'll never even get. Everyone knew what was going on around us, and everyone around it pretended they didn't see it because pretending was easier than admitting what it means. Easier than stopping it. Easier than risking your own safety. Pretend was so much easier for people than looking in the mirror and recognizing that the same hands were doing the same work in every version of history we were taught to mourn, but never to interrupt. We watch history unfold. The kind of history that was once told behind glass, in the past, with gentle regret, sad and solemn voices, old black and white videos with old broadcasts instead of real life, happening and becoming history right in front of our eyes, with blood and tears and names of the lost just piling up. We watched while people told us never again start making exceptions and timelines and technicalities until the lines between the past and the present were finally erased from memory. It became just the way things are and how they have always been, and people lost sight of what could be. That's just no, Walter. Don't tell me people didn't see this coming because we were fucking raised on it. I do wonder how many movies, TV shows, kid shows, games and novels, comic books and documentaries were made about this very subject. It was everywhere in our culture. And maybe that's what made it seem so impossible to so many. Beyond that, it was in everyone's schooling. People held high school diplomas claiming they graduated with this information learned, and yet here we are, my friend, just you and me. And you're not even here. We were shown what this looked like. We were handed the diary pages and told to remember, told to read the words of someone hiding in an attic while the once safe street below them turned into a war zone, while the people around them vanished, while the shape of the city changed, but not from explosions, but from compliance. While neighbors disappeared one at a time, not because the system was efficient, but because it didn't need to be. It just needed to keep going, keep moving, while everyone else told themselves they were safe, and saying anything against the authority would risk that safety. It breaks my heart to know how many people did not say anything. And now, here we are, neighborhoods, with empty houses and barred up schools and federal agents dragging people out into the daylight. They did not even have to hide the human rights violations. They're just wearing masks, hiding their coward faces so history can't remember their cruelty and remember them accurately. It was the same fuckers who wouldn't wear masks for the health of others, but happily put them on with no issue to keep their faces from being known, because deep down they knew this was wrong. I just know too many people wanted to pretend there was something confusing about that moment in time. But what's really, actually confusing is how many people were willing to let it repeat simply because this time it came wearing an American flag in a procedural tone, like that made a fucking difference. Like dressing it up in any flag made it acceptable for that matter. The laws on the books were used to claim legality, as if that ever had anything to do with morality, as if a signature on the document can undo the harm to these children. So, Walter, where do we go from here? When you can no longer trust the stranger next to you. Everyone looks just like another person, but will they turn on you when the pressure builds? Or will they help you find safety? Flags can't determine that. The religion you claim to follow guarantees nothing. Status, career, age, gender, none of those give you a definitive signal you can work with any real confidence. I'm actually reminded of John Carpenter's The Thing. And I felt like Kurt Russell did. Everyone around you looks like they're a normal human, but You cannot tell what's underneath their skin. And the thing, MacReady came up with a simple test with the tools available. No, Walter, I do not think we should go around stabbing people with heated copper wire to see how they react. Yes, I do think that would be amusing to some degree, and some deserve far worse. But that's not what I'm doing right now. Although, thinking about it, there's a structure there we can adapt. A way to tell who is with us and who is trying to harm us. Something simple that anyone can ask and understand what an answer means. Something a child can ask, like a go-no-go signal. Something that if dodged gives you the same reference point as a yes. So here's the question, Walter, and it's the only one that matters. Should children be harmed knowing? Not accidentally harmed, not hypothetically harmed, and definitely not as an unfortunate side effect of the way systems functions. As if we couldn't have changed the system doing the harm. I mean knowingly. Because we did know the harm that was being done. We have already measured it. We had the data, we had the footage, the timelines, we had the case files, the death certificates, the medical records, and the hunger reports, and the eviction notices, the suicide statistics, and the ICE detention logs, and the police body cams, and the overdose counts, and the GoFundMe pages, the social media profiles, and the autopsies. We knew the children were being harmed. We have known for quite some time. Look at the art and the media we made on the edges of society. It had been painted, filmed, remixed, revamped. The harm has been seen, heard, felt, documented, and debated. We kept telling stories of this knowing. And when anyone answers the question, they are not answering in a vacuum. They would be answering with the full weight of what has already been documented. And if their answer was yes, if their answer is that the system is worth the price of children being knowingly harmed to keep functioning, then they are no longer somebody I would have wanted to speak to, because there's no change coming from that position, no discussion worth having, because they have already chosen what matters to them, and it was not the children. Because once that question is asked, once it was heard, every single thing anybody did next either closed that gap to reduce the harm or took steps to make it permanent. There's no neutral ground on that. There would be no fence to sit on. There's no safe place to retreat where anyone can pretend not to know, because once the question is asked, they do know. And once someone knows, their choices would collapse into two categories: reduce the harm or uphold the system that causes it. Because responsibility begins at awareness, and that is where the system either has your consent or not. This simple question: should children be harmed knowingly, can be translated into any language, into any understanding. It's where we should have drawn the line in the sand and forced an answer. They could have dressed it up however they wanted. They can say it's about funding, or timing, or jurisdiction, or politics, or feasibility. But those are all different ways of saying the harm is okay because of a reason. You don't get to say that you're just one person, or that you're doing your best, or that it's not your job, because whenever you do say, the harm continues. The system continues. And every time you choose the structure of a system over a child, you're answering that question again and again and again until the answer doesn't feel like a choice anymore. It's just a habit, just a rhythm, just the way things are. People didn't want to seem to admit it out loud, and that's how cruelty survived. Not through force, not through repetition, through the soft erosion of responsibility into normalcy. Through people who would never describe themselves as violent, doing violence with every compromise they're willing to make. What makes this whole mess tragic is that we don't even need to imagine an alternative. We already had everything we needed. We just needed to restructure. The food existed. We literally threw away 1/3, what's that, 30 to 40% of the food we produced. How many needed to not go hungry if we would have given it away instead of destroying it to maintain a profit margin? The housing existed. We could have put a roof over the heads of tens of billions with the buildings that already existed. The clothing still exists. We produced at the time 100 billion garments annually. The medicine, the tools, the infrastructure, the labor, the knowledge, it already was there. The problem wasn't scarcity, the problem was choice and access. The problem was that we had built a system where abundance was locked behind walls made for profit and policy to be maintained, where the food, it was thrown away by the ton while children starved. Where buildings sat empty while families slept in cars, where medical care waited behind networks and billing codes while people died waiting to be seen. Walter, we called it normal. Or we called it unfortunate. We did call it the cost of doing business. But the truth is, the suffering we saw, it wasn't an accident. It was always a choice, because every part of the system that let a child suffer could have been retooled, redirected, dismantled, or refused, but instead, we maintained it. We funded it. We justified it. We elected it. And then, we pretended our hands were clean, because we didn't personally tighten the noose. Because if we didn't want children to be harmed, we would have changed everything already. The supply chains would have changed, because getting the needs of children met would have been the priority. The wage systems, because in order for care for children, you have to be able to afford the access. The school funding models, because the receipts showed us constantly spending more on bombs than students. Housing codes, because speculation was worth more than a safe environment. Healthcare would not have been used to force people to comply or to die. The policing priorities definitely would not have gone out of their way to protect a few bad apples. The infrastructure, the zoning laws, the transit routes, the tax structures, the prison pipelines, the surveillance contracts, the media spin cycles, the international policies that destabilize entire regions just so we can extract resources to feed a machine that doesn't even serve us. Every single one of those is built on keeping going. No matter the cost, so long as the cost is paid by someone else's child. If we really didn't want the harm, we would have stopped the people using the system to harm children. Or we would have slowed it down. Or we would have at least refused to keep refueling it, but we didn't. We automated it, while telling workers to fear automation. We hit it just enough to make it deniable, and let people put on an entire performance to claim it was the only way things could ever work out. And we taught ourselves to call this stability, to call it growth and working towards peace, to substitute whatever they said to cover up the reality that those who are at least able to consent to this system are abused and raped and murdered. But if what we call peace required the suffering of children to continue, then what we're calling peace is just another false equivalence. If people are harmed for your safety, that's not peace, Walter. That's just a more palatable form of war. Because if we actually believed in care, if we meant half of the things we performed about doing this for the children, about loving them or protecting them or valuing their lives more than our convenience, then not a single part of this world would have been left standing as it did. We would not have been running a society that hands out inspirational slogans while rationing insulin. We would not have been posting videos of classroom massacres and sending only our fucking thoughts and our empty prayers while the next batch of emergency kits are ordered in bulk, preemptively, as if a body count was now part of the curriculum. We definitely would not have watched children sleep in cars or under bridges or in bus stations and calling it unfortunate instead of calling it what it was: engineered, deliberate, and sustained abandonment. Fair enough, Walter. It wasn't like that in every town on every street. But we don't live in a vacuum. We wouldn't have been funding prisons more than schools. We wouldn't have been normalizing trauma responses in 10-year-olds, would not have buried them under standardized metrics designed to turn wonder into obedience. Seriously, if care meant anything, anything at all, there would have been many more people in the streets ready to tear down the institutional harm, not because people are irrational, but because the most rational response to institutional harm against children is to make the harm stop immediately at any cost. And what did we do? Every day, every cycle, every budget, every deflection was reinforcing the system of cruel people that chewed through them, pretending that a better outcome was slowly coming. We pretended that more oversight or more funding or more faith in the same gears that ground them down would produce anything different. And it never did. We knew it wouldn't, because if we had really meant it, we would have changed everything long ago. Maybe worse than that is we didn't just allow it, we built our entire lives on top of it. Structured our daily rhythms and assumptions that somewhere, someone else's child would be paying the cost we don't want to see. Every convenience, every luxury item, every dollar paid for those on top to keep harming children and help them avoid consequences, every comfort of modern life rested on layers of suffering, scrubbed clean of fingerprints. We coded it into supply chains and labor contracts and zoning ordinances and silence. We built cities that displaced children before they could speak. We handed them flags before we gave them food. We taught them how to pledge allegiance before they knew how to be themselves, as if nationality meant more than individuality. Then, with all the audacity to act surprised when they broke, when they fought, or even when they don't make it, we blamed the children for what the system did to them before they could even name it. We held them responsible for adapting to a world that was never designed for their safety. And we allowed the people who made the most noise about protecting children vote them into cages, to deport them, starve them, shoot them, shame them into silence. And no, it was never whether we cared, because we cared just enough to use them, to photograph them, to campaign on them. Oh, to cite them when it helps and to erase them when it doesn't. Repeat that, I didn't hear it. No, once more. Yes, that's not care, that's consumption. Walter, I do think the waiting was one of the authorities' greatest weapons. Our delay was never neutral. Every second we spent asking whether it was really that bad is a second that was bought with someone else's suffering. And the harm never slowed down just because the people were trying to decide how they felt about it. And that everything has already happened. The red flags were raised. The footage was shown. The signal fires have been lit and brightened the night sky for a time. The policies were already in motion, terrorizing neighborhoods in the night. The budgets were already passed. They paid for the thugs with the money stolen from the services we already paid for. The agents were always going to be on their way. They were separating families at the border long before the American cities were hit. The children were already counted as the cost of security. So what's left? What's always been left is not a new revelation or a better explanation, but whether the people could be made aware. And if so, would they keep pretending they aren't aware? That would have been a moment that could have changed the observed outcome. But for now, Walter, we hold on to hope. That if people did know all of this, that they would stop asking for permission to stop it. Or would they keep waiting for more harm? Whether those who understand the cost will keep paying that cost to those in authority on time. Walter, I do think the only thing more dangerous than a system that harms children knowingly is a society that keeps functioning anyway, in spite of that knowledge. And the only thing that interrupts that kind of momentum is refusal. And not once, but constantly, in every direction, with every tool you have left. Because the only thing worse than failing to stop the harming of children is helping others harm them in your stead so you have more time to feel comfortable. So I do. I send this back with the full weight of knowing what it means. And what follows once the question is asked, Walter. The math supports that this time will be demonstrably different if people are made aware of their